They laughed when he bought a flooded Ferrari for $300. 25 days later, he turned down $8 methers for it. 41 people watched it happen. 41 people standing in a gravel lot off Route 9 outside Meridian, Georgia, on a Tuesday morning in the first week of October, the air still holding the last of summer heat, the sky the kind of pale white that comes before real weather moves in. 41 people, and every single one of them laughed. The car sat in the corner of the auction lot behind a strip of yellow caution tape, half submerged in its own reputation. A 2004 Ferrari 360 Modena Spider. Rosso Corsa Red, or it had been once, before the floodwater got into it. Now the paint was the color of something that had given up. The interior was gone, dissolved, rotted, stripped down to bare aluminum and corroded brackets. The engine had seized. The wiring harness was a black, brittle ruin. 3 appraisers had looked at it in the last 6 weeks. All 3 had used the same word. They had used the word irreparable. The starting bid was $300. One man raised his hand. He was standing near the back of the crowd, 32 years old, 5'11", and lean in the way that comes not from a gym, but from work. His jacket was olive drab canvas, worn at both elbows, with a grease line along the right cuff that hadn't washed out in 3 cycles. His hands, when he lowered the auction paddle, were the hands of someone who had spent a long time taking things apart and putting them back together in the dark. Beside him, a 6-year-old girl in red sneakers held a small stuffed rabbit with one floppy ear and a button eye that had been replaced with a piece of amber felt. The rabbit's name was Biscuit. The girl's name was Nora. She was holding Biscuit by one leg the way children hold things they trust completely. The laughter that went through the crowd was not mean, exactly. It was the laughter of people who believed they were witnessing a mistake. A man who clearly couldn't afford what things were worth, buying something that wasn't worth anything. The auctioneer didn't even try to get a second bid. He just looked at his clipboard and said, "Sold. $300," and moved on. Nobody asked the man his name. Nobody asked what he intended to do with it. 25 days later, a buyer from Monaco would wire $8 million into an escrow account, contingent on acceptance. He didn't accept. Stay with this one. It earns it. The auction lot belonged to a company called Halcyon Recovery Group, which operated out of a low beige building on the edge of Meridian's industrial quarter and specialized in total loss vehicles, flood-damaged equipment, and the kind of machinery that insurance companies had already written eulogies for. The general manager was a man named Carter Voss, 47 years old, silver hair cut close at the sides. He wore a Patek Philippe on his left wrist that was worth more than most of the vehicles in his inventory. And he wore it the way men wear things they want you to notice. Carter Voss had been at Halcyon for 11 years. He had built the auction side of the business from a quarterly event in a parking lot into a twice-monthly operation that moved $2 to $3 million in distressed inventory per cycle. He was not a man who questioned his own judgment. He was not a man who had needed to. When the man in the olive jacket signed the transfer paperwork and handed over $300 in cash counted out in 20s, folded once Carter Voss watched it happen from the doorway of the management office. He watched the little girl with the stuffed rabbit stand on tiptoe to see over the counter. He watched the transaction complete, and then he said something to the woman beside him, a comment meant only for her, and she laughed. And he smiled the smile of a man who has just witnessed a minor tragedy and found it mildly entertaining. The man in the olive jacket did not look up. He signed the last line. He folded his copy. He put it in the inside pocket of the jacket, against his chest, the way you put something you intend to keep. Nora tugged his sleeve. She said, "Daddy, is that ours now?" He said, "Yes." She held Biscuit up to look at the ruined car. She studied it with the seriousness children bring to things adults have already dismissed. She said, "It's pretty." He said, "It will be." He arranged for transport that afternoon. A flatbed from a company he knew, a man named Elijah Trent, who had been moving specialty vehicles across 3 counties for 31 years, and who, when he saw the car being loaded, said nothing at all for a long moment. Then he said, "Mason, you sure about this one?" Mason Holt looked at the car on the flatbed. He ran one hand along the rocker panel, not stroking it, just reading it, The way you press your palm to a wall to feel whether the structure behind it is sound, he said. I'm sure. Elijah looked at Nora, who was feeding Biscuit a pretend piece of grass from the gravel lot. He said, She named it yet? Mason almost smiled. He said, Give her 20 minutes. By the time the flatbed reached Mason's property, a half-acre lot with a detached three-bay workshop behind a small white house on the eastern edge of Meridian, Nora had named the car Rosie. Elijah backed it in without being asked. He unhitched quietly. He didn't linger. There are things about Mason Holt that the 41 people at the auction did not know, because Mason Holt was not a man who offered information about himself as a courtesy. He had grown up in Laurel County, Kentucky, the youngest of 3 boys, in a house where the garage was warmer than the kitchen, and the most reliable encyclopedia was the factory service manual for a 1979 Chevrolet C10 that his father kept on a shelf between the WD-40 and the socket wrench. That time. His father had been a machinist. His mother had been a bookkeeper. Neither of them was alive anymore. He had left Laurel County at 17 with a score on a mechanical aptitude test that a recruiter described, with visible surprise, as the highest he had personally seen. He had spent the next 9 years in the Army. He had spent 6 of those 9 years in places he was not permitted to describe with specificity. He had come home with hands that could field strip an M4 in the dark, and a mind that processed mechanical systems the way other people processed language instinctively, without effort, as if the logic of how things worked was simply the grammar of the world. He had come home to Meridian because Claire was from Meridian. Claire, who had red hair and a way of laughing with her whole face and a sketchbook she carried everywhere, who had filled 412 pages with drawings of things she found beautiful. He had married her at the courthouse on a Wednesday because she said she didn't want a party, she wanted a marriage. They had bought the house on the eastern edge of town. They had had Nora. Claire had died when Nora was 3. An aneurysm, unexpected, catastrophic, at 31 years old, on an ordinary Thursday in February. There was no warning, and there was no preparation, and there was nothing to be done, and Mason had stood in a hospital corridor at 11:47 inches the evening with a clipboard of forms and a daughter who was asleep in his arms, and he had understood, for the first time in his life, that competence had limits. He had kept the sketchbook. It was in the top drawer of the workbench in the 3rd bay. He did not look at it often, but he knew it was there. He had taken whatever work came: restoration, recovery. Mechanical consulting for an insurance company 3 counties over that needed someone who could look at a damaged vehicle and tell them in 45 minutes whether the estimate was honest. He did not advertise. He did not have a business name. He worked by word of mouth among a small network of people who knew what he could do, and he charged fairly, and he turned down nothing reasonable, and he made enough. Nora started kindergarten in September. She liked frogs and prime numbers, and Biscuit, whom she had carried every day since the afternoon Claire died, when Mason had pressed the rabbit into her hands in the hallway outside the hospital room, and she had held it the way she has held it every day since one leg, no ceremony, with total and uncomplicated faith. The morning after the auction, Mason got up at 5:30. He made oatmeal. He packed Nora's lunch. He tied her shoes left first, then right, double-knotted, because she was still learning the motion, and this was how they practiced together, him showing, her watching, Biscuit tucked under her arm. At 6:45, he walked her to the end of the driveway and waited for the bus. At 7:03, he went to the workshop and stood in front of the car. He stood there for 4 minutes without touching it. Then he put on his glasses' clear safety lenses, scratched at the lower left corner, and he began. The assessment alone took 3 days, not because he was uncertain, because precision requires patience, and because Mason Holt had learned, at some cost, that rushing an assessment is how you miss the one thing that changes everything. He documented everything. He used a yellow legal pad. Column 1, damage observed. Column 2, root cause. Column 3, remediation path. His handwriting was small and even, the handwriting of a man who had spent years writing maintenance logs in conditions that did not reward sloppiness. The engine, a 3. 6-liter Tipo F-131 flat-plane V8 had seized, as reported, but seized was not destroyed. Water ingestion during the flood event had hydraulically locked the cylinders, and the previous owner or an overeager recovery technician had, at some point afterward, attempted to turn the engine over without first clearing the cylinders, which had bent 2 connecting rods. 2. Not all 8. 2. The wiring harness was a near-total loss. But near-total was not total. The chassis was clean. The monocoque, the structural tub that Ferrari machined from aluminum, was straight. Not warped, not cracked, not compromised. Whoever had towed this car had towed it right, and the frame had been sitting in floodwater, not crushed into something. The suspension geometry was intact. The brake components were seized from corrosion but not structurally failed. The gearbox was the second piece of good news. The F1 paddle shift transmission had been sealed at the factory to a tolerance that even sustained water exposure hadn't defeated. It was dormant. It was not dead. On the third evening, Mason sat on a stool in the third bay with the legal pad on his knee and a mug of coffee, gone cold, on the floor beside him. Nora was asleep in the house. Biscuit was on the kitchen counter because Nora had set him there to watch through the window while she slept, which was something she had started doing in the last year, leaving Biscuit stationed at windows as if the rabbit had duties. Mason looked at the legal pad. He looked at the car. Not impossible, he wrote. Then he crossed it out. Then he wrote 22 weeks. Then he crossed that out too. He wrote 20. He ordered the parts on a Friday. Some of them took time. The connecting rods Ferrari did not produce replacement rods for this engine. He sourced them from a specialist in Modena, Italy, a man named Gianfranco Lucchi, who had been machining Ferrari components since before Mason was born and who asked, in careful English, whether the rest of the engine warranted the expenditure. Mason photographed the block and sent the images. Gianfranco replied within 2 hours. He said, "The block is good." He said, "I will send the rods." The wiring harness Mason rebuilt himself. He had done this before, twice, on different platforms, under different conditions. It required a wiring diagram. He sourced the official Cavallino technical documentation through a contact at a Ferrari mark registry, a heat gun, a crimper, solder, heat shrink tubing in 6 gauges, 411 individual conductors, and time. He worked 2 hours every morning before Nora woke up, and 2 hours every evening after she was in bed. And for 3 Saturdays in a row, he worked from 6 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, while Nora sat on a stool beside the bench and drew horses and narrated the drawings to Biscuit in a low, serious voice. On the 14th day, at 7:22 inches the morning, Mason Holt connected the last ground wire in the rebuilt harness, closed the engine cover, and turned the ignition key. The car did not start. He sat back. He did not swear. He did not slam anything. He looked at the dashboard and let his eyes move across the cluster, the way a doctor reads a set of vitals, not searching for one number, taking in the whole. The fuel pressure sensor. It was reading 0. Not because there was no pressure, because the sensor itself had failed, a component he had flagged on his legal pad as damaged but considered functional. He had been wrong. He was wrong perhaps twice a year, and he noted it and corrected it without drama, the way his father had taught him. He replaced the sensor on the 15th day. It took 40 minutes. On the 15th day, at 4:51 inches the afternoon, with Nora standing at the edge of the second bay, holding Biscuit in both arms, because something in the moment had communicated its significance to her, Mason Holt turned the ignition key on a car that 3 appraisers had called irreparable. The engine turned over. It caught. It settled. The flat-plane V8 idled at 950 revolutions per minute, perfectly even, with a sound that was not loud, not yet. Not at idle, but with a texture and authority that was unmistakable to anyone who had ever been near one. A sound like a musical instrument that had been silent for years, tuned and played again. Nora's eyes went wide. She held Biscuit up, both arms, presenting him to the running car the way people raise things to be witnessed. She said, "Rosie's awake." Mason put his hand on the steering wheel. He did not smile yet. He listened. Word moves in small towns along invisible wires, and Meridian was a small town at its edge. By the 18th day, Carter Voss knew the car was running. He knew because Elijah Trent had mentioned it to a parts supplier, and the parts supplier mentioned it to a man who detailed vehicles for Halcyon on contract, and that man mentioned it in passing to Carter's assistant, a woman named Diane, who had been at Halcyon for 9 years and who noticed everything and filed it quietly in a mental ledger she never discussed. Carter received the information on a Wednesday afternoon. He processed it the way he processed most information quickly, with the instinct of a man whose entire professional skill was assessing the gap between what something appeared to be worth and what it actually was. If the car was running, it was no longer a parts curiosity. If the car was running and restorable, it was potentially a 6-figure vehicle. If the car was running and restorable and documented correctly with provenance, with a clean title, with a competent restoration record, it was something else entirely. A running 2004 Ferrari 360 Spider with documented restoration could comfortably approach $400,000. A Concours quality restoration with factory-authenticated components and professional documentation could exceed $600,000. He had sold it for $300. Carter Voss was not a man who liked being on the wrong side of a transaction. He was, in fact, a man who had built his professional identity on never being on the wrong side of a transaction. He sat in his office for 20 minutes. Then he told Diane to find Mason Holt's contact information. The phone rang on the 19th day while Mason was working on the paint, not the final coat, not yet, but the prep work, the blocking, the leveling of what would become the surface that would become the finish. He answered, because the number was local. Carter Voss introduced himself. He was smooth. He was practiced. He said he had heard the car was in better condition than initially assessed, and that given the circumstances, he thought there might be an opportunity to discuss a buyback arrangement. He said he felt there had been a discrepancy in how the vehicle was originally cataloged, and that he wanted to make it right. Mason listened. He did not interrupt. When Carter finished, Mason said, "Make an offer." Carter said, $120,000. He said it the way a man says a number he expects to be received as generosity. Mason said, "No, thank you." Carter said, "You bought it for $300." Mason said, "I know what I bought it for." Carter said, after a pause that was not entirely comfortable, "The market for vehicles like this is narrower than people assume. I can connect you with the right buyers. Without the right connections, you're looking at a much longer process to realize any significant," Mason said. "I'll be in touch if I change my mind." He ended the call. He went back to blocking the panel. On the 20th day, he called a man named Werner Bowman, who had been the senior appraiser for a Mark specialist auction house in Atlanta for 22 years, and who had, 3 years prior, appraised a vehicle for a mutual contact and given Mason his card with a specific instruction: "Call me if you ever have something real." Werner drove to Meridian on the 21st day. He spent 2 hours with the car. He walked around it 3 times. He got underneath it on a creeper and stayed there for 11 minutes. He read Mason's legal pad, all of it, from the first column to the last page. He inspected the connecting rods that had come from Gianfranco in Modena, and he held one up to the light, and his expression changed in a way that Mason noticed. He looked at the wiring harness documentation Mason had photographed every stage of the rebuild, labeled every splice, printed the images in sequence, and bound them in a manila folder. Werner stood in the third bay for a long time. He said, "Where did you learn to do this?" Mason said, "From a lot of different people." Werner looked at the car again. Then he looked at Mason. He said, "You understand what you have." It was not a question. Mason said, "Yes." Werner said, "I need to make some calls." The calls Werner made over the following 2 days reached into a world Mason Holt had never sought access to, a network of collectors, dealers, and Mark-specific buyers operating at a level where provenance and documentation carried as much weight as the vehicle itself. In this world, a 2004 Ferrari 360 Spider was not a 6-figure commodity. It was a chapter in a story about a mark, about a specific era of engineering, about what a particular manufacturer had been doing with particular materials in a particular moment, and a resurrection story, a car that 3 appraisers had called irreparable, documented back to life with factory-spec components, and a 41-page photographic rebuild record that was not a chapter. That was the whole book. Werner called Mason on the morning of the 23rd day. He said, "I have 3 interested parties." He paused. He said, "Mason, I need to tell you who one of them is." The name was Aldrich Beaumont. He was 63 years old. He was Belgian by birth, Monegasque by residence, and one of the most significant private collectors of post-war Italian performance cars in the world. His collection was housed in a purpose-built, climate-controlled facility outside Monaco. It was not open to the public. It was not photographed for magazines. It existed because Aldrich Beaumont found certain machines beautiful and wished to be near them, and because he had the resources to act on that preference without apology. Werner said, "He wants to come and see it." Mason said, "When?" Werner said, "He's asking about next week." But he also wanted to communicate, he said this specifically, he wanted it communicated directly that if the documentation is what I described, he is prepared to bid $8 million. The workshop was very quiet. Nora was in the house. Through the window between the third bay and the kitchen, Mason could see Biscuit on the counter, stationed at his post. Mason said, "Tell him he's welcome to come." Aldrich Beaumont arrived on the morning of the 25th day in a rented car with a driver and a single associate, a young woman named Fenna, who carried a notebook and spoke 4 languages, and whose job, as far as Mason could tell, was to observe and record with precision. Beaumont himself was a compact man with gray at his temples and the unhurried quality of someone who has not needed to rush in a very long time. He said almost nothing for the first 40 minutes. He looked at the car. He touched it in specific places, the seams, the junction points, the areas where 2 components met, and the quality of the meeting told you something about how it had been assembled and reassembled. He read the manila folder. He read every page. He held the wiring documentation up to the light coming through the bay door. Nora came out of the house at 10:15. She was carrying Biscuit under her arm, and a drawing she had made the previous evening of Rosie, rendered in red crayon, the car looking something like a shoe with wheels, but the proportions communicating an earnestness that was its own kind of accuracy. Aldrich Beaumont looked at the drawing for a moment. He crouched down to Nora's level. He asked her the car's name. She said, "Rosie." He said, "That is a good name." She showed him Biscuit. She said, "Biscuit likes Rosie too." She said Biscuit could tell Rosie was sad before and now she's not. Beaumont looked at the rabbit with the replaced button eye. He did not smile the way adults smile at children when they are waiting for the child to finish. He looked at the rabbit the way he had looked at the car, with attention. He stood and turned to Mason. He said, "The offer I communicated is a genuine offer." He said, "It is not a negotiating position." Mason looked at Rosie. He stood with his hands in the pockets of his jacket, the olive drab canvas one, the one with the grease line on the right cuff. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I appreciate that." Beaumont waited. Mason said, "I'm not going to sell." The associate, Fenna, stopped writing. Beaumont said, "May I ask why?" Mason looked at Nora. She had moved back to her stool at the edge of the bay and was showing Biscuit the drawing, comparing it to the actual car, making small adjustments to the rabbit's viewing angle. He said, "She named it." Beaumont looked at the girl with the rabbit for a moment. "Not the car, the girl," he said. "I understand." He pulled a card from his inside pocket. He set it on the workbench with a precise, unhurried movement. He said, "If that changes," he said, "it will not depreciate." He said goodbye to Nora. He said goodbye to Mason. He did not say goodbye to Biscuit, but on the way to the car he glanced back, once, at the rabbit on the stool, with an expression that Werner, watching from near the bay door, would later describe as something close to recognition. Carter Voss heard about the $8 million offer the same afternoon. He heard about it from the same invisible wire that had brought him the news of the running engine, but this time the information arrived differently, with a quality of weight and consequence that the earlier report had lacked. He made a second call to Mason Holt. This call did not go as well as the first. Carter was less smooth this time. He suggested that the terms of the original auction might be worth examining. He used the phrase procedural irregularity. He used the phrase at our discretion. He said that auction results on vehicles with documentation discrepancies were sometimes subject to review. Mason listened to all of it. He said, "I have the transfer document." He said, "It's signed by you." He said, "Column 2, line 4, condition as described." He said, "I have a lawyer." He said this the way he said most things, not loudly, not as a threat, as a statement of available fact. Carter Voss said he would be in touch. He was not in touch. 3 weeks later, Werner Bowman would show Mason a single document, an internal Halcyon Recovery Group assessment form from 6 weeks before the auction, initialed by Carter Voss, which noted the vehicle's structural integrity as within restorable parameters and its classification as a recoverable asset, and which had not been reflected in the auction catalog. The catalog had listed the vehicle as unrecoverable. That classification had been Carter Voss's decision. That decision had produced a $300 transaction instead of one that might have reflected the vehicle's actual potential. Mason read the document twice. He folded it once. He put it in his inside pocket next to the transfer papers. He did not call Carter Voss. He called a lawyer named Adrian Walsh, who had been handling business disputes in Meridian for 26 years, and who, when Mason sat across from him and laid out the sequence of events, with the documents in order, said nothing for 30 seconds. Then he said, "The misclassification is either negligent or deliberate." Mason said, "I know." Adrian Walsh said, "You understand you have a remedy here that goes well beyond the car." Mason said, "I know that too." It was Nora who found the note. It was in Claire's sketchbook. Mason had opened it not for the first time since Claire died, but for the first time in 8 months on the evening of the 26th day. After Beaumont had gone, and the workshop was quiet, and Nora was asleep, he had taken the sketchbook from the top drawer and sat with it on the stool in the third bay. He turned to a page near the middle. It was a drawing of a car. Not detailed, not technically precise. Claire had not been a technical illustrator. But it was clearly a sports car, and it was clearly red. And across the bottom of the page, in her handwriting, she had written, "For the love of broken things." He sat with it for a while. He did not know when she had drawn it. He did not know what she had been thinking about when she wrote the line. He knew that she had carried the sketchbook everywhere, and that she had filled it with things she found beautiful, and that she had, at some point, decided that a broken red car was one of those things. He put the sketchbook away. He turned off the light in the third bay. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at Rosie in the dark. Not a ruin. Not anymore. The legal matter moved quietly, the way legal matters do when the documentation is clean, and the opposing party is aware that they are on the wrong side of the paper. Carter Voss's attorney communicated an offer of settlement. The figure was substantial. Mason discussed it with Adrian Walsh and told him to negotiate for 2 additional provisions: a full corrected disclosure in Halcyon's auction records, and a formal letter to the state licensing board acknowledging the misclassification. Carter Voss's attorney pushed back on the letter. The negotiation took 4 days. Carter Voss signed both provisions. Mason never raised his voice. He was not present for any of the meetings. He sent Adrian Walsh with the documents and with a list of terms that did not change. Not a floor, a ceiling. He was not interested in punishing Carter Voss. He was interested in the record being accurate. Diane, who had worked at Halcyon for 9 years and who had noticed everything and filed it in a mental ledger, gave a brief statement to the licensing board through her own attorney. The statement described the assessment form and the classification decision and the sequence that followed. It was 3 paragraphs. It was sufficient. Werner Bowman came back to the workshop on a Friday in November, when the air had finally turned cold, and the workshop heater was running, and the smell of the place was warm metal and solvent, and the faint good smell of high-quality paint curing in the third bay. He brought a man with him, a man Mason didn't know, named Benjamin Achabe, who turned out to be the newly appointed director of a Marque Preservation Foundation based in Charlotte that documented and authenticated significant restorations of Italian performance vehicles. Benjamin Achabe looked at the car for 20 minutes. He looked at the documentation for 30 minutes. He asked Mason 12 questions. Mason answered all 12. Benjamin Achabe said, "This restoration is going to be cited in the Foundation's literature," he said. "If you're willing, we'd like to document the process fully." He said, The wiring rebuild alone is the most thorough field reconstruction of a Tipo F-131 harness I've seen outside of a factory service facility, Mason said. I'm willing. Werner, standing near the bay door, put his hands in his pockets. He had known Mason for 3 years. He had heard fragments of the backstory, the army, the work, Claire, the workshop on the east side. He had not known, until he had seen Mason with the car, the specific shape of what Mason Holt was. He said, I knew when I saw the legal pad. Mason looked at him. Werner said, I've seen 1,000 assessments. I've done 800 of them. I knew when I read column 3, the remediation column. He paused. He said, nobody writes it like that unless they already know the answer. Mason looked at the car. He said, you're right. I knew when I was standing in the auction lot. I knew before I bid. Werner said, why 300? Why not fight for it? Mason was quiet for a moment. He said, 300 was the price. That was the price they set. He said, they called it irreparable. He said, I didn't argue. There is a photograph that Werner took on his phone, without asking, on the afternoon of the 21st day. It shows Mason Holt in the third bay, kneeling beside the front wheel arch of a red Ferrari, making a small correction to the fit of a panel. His safety glasses are on. His jacket is hanging on a hook above the bench. His arms are bare, and the definition in them is the definition of someone who has worked with their hands for a long time. And on the stool at the edge of the bay, slightly out of focus, sits a stuffed rabbit with one floppy ear and a replaced button eye, sitting upright, facing the car, as if watching. Werner did not post it anywhere. He showed it to Mason, who looked at it without comment. He showed it to Benjamin Akebe, who asked if he could include it in the foundation documentation. Mason said, ask Nora. It's her rabbit. Nora said yes. She said Biscuit would like that. She said she wanted a copy too. In the first week of December, Nora's kindergarten class had a sharing day, which was what they called the event when children brought something from home to describe to the class. Nora brought a photograph. Not the photograph Werner had taken, her own. She had taken it on the tablet Mason kept in the kitchen the morning after the car started, standing on her stool in the second bay. In the photograph, Rosie, the engine running, a faint heat shimmer visible above the exhaust, red paint not yet finished, but the shape of it unmistakable. And in the lower right corner of the frame, slightly blurred, Biscuit, held at arm's length toward the car. Her teacher asked her to describe what was in the photo. Nora held it up for the class. She said, that's our car. She said, her name is Rosie. She said, my dad fixed her. The teacher asked, was she very broken? Nora thought about this with the seriousness she brought to factual questions. She said, she wasn't broken. She was just waiting. On a Tuesday morning in December, Mason Holt made oatmeal. He packed Nora's lunch. He tied her shoes left first, then right, double knotted. She was almost doing it herself now. The motion was almost there. He walked her to the end of the driveway and waited for the bus. When it came, she climbed the steps and turned in the doorway and held Biscuit up, one arm extended, the way she always did when she was going somewhere. Biscuit couldn't follow a small ceremony of parting that Mason had never suggested and never named. He raised one hand. The door folded shut. He stood at the end of the driveway until the bus turned at the corner, and the sound of it faded into the ordinary sounds of a December morning in a small town, a dog somewhere, a truck on Route 9, the dry rattle of leaves along the gutter. He went back to the workshop. Rosie was in the third bay, paint finished, panels fitted, the interior rebuilt from scratch over 7 days, using period-correct materials that had taken 3 weeks to source. She was not a museum piece. She was a car. She smelled like fresh leather and clean metal, and the specific smell of a V8 engine that has been run at temperature and maintained with attention. Mason opened the driver's door. He got in. He sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. He looked at the dash. He looked through the windshield at the workshop wall, where Nora's drawing of Rosie was taped the red shoe with wheels, the crayon smudge in the lower corner where she had pressed too hard. He started the engine. He did not go anywhere. He sat in the third bay with the engine running and his hands on the wheel and the flat-plane V8 talking to itself at idle, even and clear and unhurried, like something that had always known how to do this, and it only needed someone to understand. He stayed there for a while,